So from the very beginning, Sabbath served to commemorate, memorialize, and recall historical acts and deliverances of God, most notably God's creation and the Exodus. Every week that Israel celebrated the Sabbath, they remembered these great events of the past, their creation and their deliverance. In Exodus 16, the Lord provided bread from heaven, manna, for his people in the wilderness. It was within the context of this provision that Israel was first instructed in the practice of Sabbath. On the sixth day, Israel was commanded to gather twice as much manna so that they would be able to rest on the seventh day. No manna was provided on the seventh day, while any manna left overnight on any other day was spoiled by the next morning. But the extra manna gathered on the day before the Sabbath was miraculously preserved from spoiling. So Israel had to trust that God would provide their daily bread, including bread for the Sabbath. The Exodus rationale for keeping the Sabbath is the call to imitate the practice of God the Creator, to interrupt work and to rest and reflect and participate in the holiness and the blessedness of the day. While in Exodus, the remembrance of the Sabbath is associated with creation, in Deuteronomy, God's people are called to keep the Sabbath as they remember their liberation. In both cases, the element of remembering and looking back at the great things that the Lord has done is present. God's mighty acts are remembered when we keep the Sabbath. But the act of remembering also has a futuristic outlook, that is, remembering today in order to obey tomorrow. Therefore, the reason for Sabbath keeping, according to Deuteronomy, is to remember what life was like when Israel had a lord named Pharaoh who did not allow for days off. For generations, they served Pharaoh, a burdensome master who gave no rest to the slaves, and when complaints arose, said, "Now make bricks without straw." God graciously intruded into that reality and said to the people, "You will no longer serve Pharaoh, you will serve me." And to serve me means that once every 7 days, you, your kids, your workers, even your animals get the day off. Why? Because God's gracious intrusion into human existence was not a one-time event, but a regular ritualized reality. And so we must keep on remembering and keep on obeying this commandment. The Sabbath is a day of liberation and freedom. On the practice of Sabbath keeping, we remember that it doesn't all depend on us. It is God who is our creator and who continues to create with us and in us. And it is God who is our deliverer, who continues to deliver us daily from dangers seen and unseen. It is God who is the source of all of our blessings. The Lord set Israel free from its slavery and gave them his Sabbath rest. And in doing so, Israel is called to treat their slaves in a similar manner, remembering and then obeying. The Mosaic Law moves us from slavery toward liberation. The liberation enjoyed collectively by the nation must be extended to all its members. In Deuteronomy chapter 5, God makes this clear and says, "On the Sabbath you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your ox or your donkey or any livestock or the stranger who is within your gates, that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you." And so this gift of Sabbath must be given to all. To keep the Sabbath is not merely to rest and to give rest one day in 7, but to uphold a society in which no one is subject to the burdensome and unceasing labor that characterized Israel's life in Egypt. The Sabbath day was a repeated reminder of the Lord's intent that all in Israel, from the richest to the poorest, the native and the stranger, should know him as their liberating God. And so there is still a need for Sabbath because many of us are still enslaved. Many of us are enslaved by our careers, working 7 days a week, enslaved by the responsibilities of caring for our family, everyday activities, including Saturday and Sunday. We are enslaved by our thinking that we must do it today, we must finish it today, we are the only ones who can do it right. We also still have modern day pharaohs, sweatshops, slave labor right here in the United States. When a garment is made in the USA, that doesn't automatically mean the garment was produced in an environment free from exploitation. Through subcontracting, brands that manufacture garments in the US can easily find loopholes that lead to multiple labor violations, such as unethical working hours, wage theft, and unmonitored and unsafe working conditions. So the question is there justice in Sabbath keeping? Is there justice for all? Is there Sabbath rest for all? Rabbi Jonah Dov Pesner believes that Shabbat is a call to action. And so when I read this, I thought, wow, that's an oxymoron, right? A rest, but a call to action. In a recent blog, he answers the question, what does Sabbath and social justice have in common? He says, on the 7th day, we experience the world as it should be. The other 6 days of the week, we inhabit the world as it is, the real world, and the real world is broken. Therefore, while Shabbat is a day of rejoicing, it also has the power to agitate. Shabbat pushes us to see injustice in our world, to worry for those who cry out in hunger around us, to mourn the loss of our natural resources, and to rage against the forces of oppression and injustice that plague humanity. So our rituals, our observances and celebrations on the 7th day, or as we call it, the Lord's Day, all seek to fulfill the promise of creation, to inspire our hope for redemption, and to depict a vision of a world repaired. Just as Shabbat calls us to provide rest for the earth, it reminds us that rest for human beings is an imperative of social justice. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, formerly a professor at Hebrew College right here in Newton, and the rabbi who marched with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in Selma, Alabama, in his book, Moral Grandeur and Spiritual Audacity, he famously writes, "Morally speaking, there is no limit to the concern one must feel for the suffering of human beings. that indifference to evil is worse than evil itself, that in a free society, some are guilty, but all are responsible. On Shabbat, we taste perfection, but then we are called to action. Responsible for the well-being of the earth itself and for all those who suffer amidst the brokenness of injustice. Rabbi Heschel believes strongly that in the Western world, in our world, we have lost our sense of the sacred. In our attempts to master our physical surroundings through technological advancement, we have become desensitized to the grandeur and beauty of life. In our rush to industrialize, we have become so focused on gaining economic and political power that we have forgotten our ultimate purpose, which is to serve as co-creators with the divine in the establishment of a just and compassionate world. If anybody's looking for purpose, right, there it is, to serve as co-creators with the divine in the establishment of a just and compassionate world. Sabbath is often connected with self-care, right? I bet you thought you were going to get a sermon on that, right? On self-care. Because we need self-care, because we need to have margin and boundaries in order to live as people, the people that God called us to be. However, a day of rest, of renewal, of gratitude, and remembering God should not only provide us with the needed time off, but it should also have an impact on the remainder of the week. The outward result of a centered soul and knowing the love of God will lead us to love our neighbors as ourselves and subsequently live lives of love and justice. Not only that, we will want to help others who live in context in which they do not have the space to even think about a Sabbath, can't even think about a day of rest because of the demands of this world. So by taking Sabbath, we can all be more awake in our daily lives to the injustices that surround us. And we can then have the energy to tackle these injustices head on. So Sabbath is a gift that God has given to his children to help them to be able to live in this restless world. So here's what we have to do. We have to take it. We have to take that Sabbath and use it to further the call to pursue justice. So the spiritual disciplines of prayer and Sabbath are truly instrumental in the fight for justice in this world. Amen. Amen.